Welcome back to Her True Stories, where we share incredible true tales of survival, strength, and justice. I'm your host, and today's story will absolutely shock you. If you've ever been dismissed by your own family, if anyone has ever told you that your feelings don't matter, this story is for you. A 60-year-old woman named Amelia thought her son's greed had simply stolen her last precious memory. Instead, she discovered a secret that would change everything. Before we dive in, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These stories need to be heard. Now, let's see how one woman's heartbreak became the key to the most perfect revenge. My name is Amelia Carter, and at 60 years old, I thought I knew everything about loss. I was wrong. The morning it all began, I stood in my bedroom holding an empty velvet jewelry box, staring at the space where my husband Richard's Rolex had lived for the 3 years since his death. The watch wasn't just a timepiece. It was the last tangible connection to the man I'd loved for 35 years, the final piece of him I could still touch when the loneliness became unbearable. My hands trembled as I searched through every drawer, every shelf, every possible place the watch could have been moved. But deep in my heart, I already knew the truth. There was only one person who had access to my home, who knew where I kept my most precious belongings, who had been pressuring me about money for months. My son, Daniel. The phone call that confirmed my worst fears came 20 minutes later, just as I was standing in my living room trying to convince myself there had to be another explanation. "Mom, it's me." Daniel's voice came through with that familiar tone of forced casualness that meant trouble. "Listen, before you get upset, I want you to know that what I did was necessary." My blood turned to ice. "Daniel, please tell me you didn't." "I sold Dad's watch." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank into my favorite armchair, the one Richard used to read to me from, and felt the world tilt on its axis. "You what?" "I needed the money, Mom. Vivian has been planning this European vacation for months, and my business account is temporarily tied up." The watch was just sitting there collecting dust. Just sitting there? My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. "Daniel, that watch was your father's. It was the only thing of his I had left." "Oh, come on, Mom. Don't be so dramatic. It's just a watch. Dad's gone. He doesn't need it anymore." The casual cruelty of his words took my breath away. I sat there clutching the phone, staring at the empty jewelry box on my coffee table, unable to speak. "Mom? Are you there? Look, I know you're upset, but you need to be practical about these things. Dad would have wanted us to use his stuff if we needed it." "He would have wanted you to ask first," I whispered. Daniel sighed, that exaggerated sound he'd made since childhood, when he thought I was being unreasonable. "You would have said no." "Yes, I would have." "Exactly. So I saved us both the argument. The watch sold for $8,000, which is perfect for Vivian's trip. I'll bring you back something nice from Paris." I closed my eyes, seeing Richard's face as clearly as if he were sitting across from me. He'd worn that Rolex every day for 20 years, checking it during our daughter's piano recitals, glancing at it during our anniversary dinners, winding it carefully every morning as part of his routine. It had been on his wrist when he took his last breath in the hospital. "Which pawn shop?" I asked quietly. "What? Which pawn shop did you sell it to?" "Mom, you're not seriously thinking of buying it back, are you? Because that would be completely—" "Which shop, Daniel?" He was quiet for a moment, and I could hear Vivian laughing in the background, probably already packing her designer clothes for their romantic getaway funded by my grief. "Kessler's on Fairfax." "But Mom, seriously, you need to let this go. It's just a material object. Dad wouldn't want you clinging to." I hung up on him. For a long time, I sat in that chair holding the empty jewelry box, remembering the last conversation Richard and I had about that watch. He'd been so weak by then, his cancer eating away at everything we'd built together, but he'd managed to take my hand and whisper, "When I'm gone, keep this safe. It has stories to tell." I'd thought he meant the stories of our life together. Our first date when he'd nervously checked the time every 5 minutes. Our wedding day, when the second hand had counted down to our first kiss as husband and wife. The countless ordinary moments when that watch had marked the passage of our shared time. Now Daniel had traded those stories for his wife's European adventure. At 60, I'd survived breast cancer, Richard's long illness, and the crushing loneliness of widowhood. I'd rebuilt my life piece by careful piece, finding new routines and small joys. But this betrayal cut deeper than any of those losses because it came from my own son. The boy I'd raised, the man I'd supported through 2 failed businesses and a string of poor decisions, the child who'd cried in my arms when his father died. That same person had stolen my last connection to Richard and dismissed my grief as drama. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror as I prepared to leave for the pawn shop. My gray hair was still long and elegant, swept back with the pearl combs Richard had given me for our 20th anniversary. My skin showed my years but gracefully, and I carried myself with the dignity that had taken 6 decades to cultivate. I was still beautiful in the way that mature women can be when they've learned to value substance over surface. But in my eyes, I saw something new, a hardness that hadn't been there that morning. The drive to Kessler's pawn shop took me through neighborhoods I hadn't visited in years. This wasn't the kind of place a woman like me usually frequented, but desperation makes us do things we never imagined possible. The shop was exactly what I'd expected. Narrow aisles crammed with the abandoned treasures of people who'd run out of options. Musical instruments that had once made beautiful music, jewelry that had marked special occasions, electronics that had connected families. All of it reduced to price tags and display cases. Mr. Kessler himself was a surprise. I'd expected someone rough, street-hardened, but he was a small, neat man in his 70s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Can I help you?" he asked, looking up from a watch he'd been examining under a magnifying lamp. "My son sold you a Rolex," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "A vintage Submariner. I'd like to buy it back." His expression shifted immediately. "Ah, you must be Mrs. Carter." The fact that he knew my name surprised me. "You were expecting me? Your son mentioned you might come by. He seemed quite certain you would." He studied my face carefully. "He also seemed quite certain you wouldn't be able to afford to get it back." The casual cruelty of Daniel's assumption hit me like a slap. He'd not only stolen Richard's watch, but he'd gloated about it to strangers. "How much?" I asked. "Well, that's where things get interesting," Mr. Kessler said. He moved to a safe behind the counter and withdrew a familiar velvet box. I was examining the piece when I noticed something unusual. He opened the box, and there was Richard's Rolex, looking exactly as it had on his wrist for all those years. The steel bracelet gleamed under the shop's fluorescent lights, and the black face showed the time with the precision that had made him trust it completely. "Beautiful piece," Mr. Kessler said. 1970s, excellent condition. But when I opened the case back to authenticate it, I found this. He turned the watch over and showed me something I'd never noticed, a tiny, almost invisible seam in the case back. As I watched, he pressed a nearly microscopic lever, and a small panel slid open. Inside the hidden compartment were several folded pieces of paper and what looked like a tiny computer chip. "I've been in this business for 40 years, Mr. Kessler said quietly. "I've seen hidden compartments in jewelry before, but never anything quite like this. These documents. Mrs. Carter, I think you need to see what your husband was keeping." With shaking hands, I unfolded the papers. The first was a handwritten note in Richard's careful script, "For Amelia, when the truth can finally be told." The second document made my blood turn to ice. It was a copy of a bank statement showing transfers from our joint accounts to an offshore account I'd never heard of. The signature authorizing the transfers wasn't Richard's. It was Daniel's. The dates on the transfers corresponded exactly with the final months of Richard's illness, when Daniel had been so helpful with managing our finances while I focused on Richard's care. "Mrs. Carter?" Mr. Kessler's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" I stared at the papers, my world reshaping itself around this new reality. Richard hadn't been just a loving husband. He'd been a man who suspected his own son of theft and had hidden evidence in the one place he knew I'd eventually find it. The watch hadn't been keeping time for Richard all those years. It had been keeping secrets. Before we continue with Amelia's shocking discovery, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If you've ever been told you're too old to start over, let me tell you, that's a lie. Your story isn't over, and you still have chapters left to write. Our best-selling book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, is filled with simple, powerful steps to help you heal, rebuild, and fall in love with life again. Click the link in the description box and start your new beginning today. Like this video if Amelia's strength inspires you. Subscribe for more real stories of resilience, and ring that notification bell, because sometimes the most powerful transformations happen when we discover the truth we never knew we needed. Now, let's see what else Amelia found in that watch. I sat in Mr. Kessler's small office behind the shop, the stolen bank statements spread across his desk like evidence at a crime scene. My hands no longer shook. Shock has a way of creating its own strange calm. "How long have you had the watch?" I asked. 3 days. Your son was quite eager to sell it quickly. Mr. Kessler poured tea from a small electric kettle in the corner. He kept checking the time on his phone, said he had a flight to catch. Of course. Daniel and Vivian were probably already sipping champagne in first class, toasting their European adventure with money stolen from his dying father. I picked up the computer chip, no bigger than my fingernail. "What do you think this is?" "I'm not certain, but I have a nephew who works with computers. If you'd like, I could ask him to take a look." The rational part of me said to take everything to the police immediately. But the woman who'd just discovered her son was a thief wanted to know exactly how deep his betrayal went before deciding how to respond. "Yes," I said. "I'd like to know everything this contains." Mr. Kessler nodded and carefully placed the chip in a small envelope. "I'll call him tonight. Can you come back tomorrow?" "What about the watch? How much do you need for it?" He waved a hand dismissively. "Mrs. Carter, your son may have the legal right to sell his father's belongings, but morally, this watch belongs with you. Take it." I stared at him in surprise. "I can't just take it. You paid Daniel." "I paid Daniel $500. $500. The bank statements showed Daniel had told me he'd gotten $8,000. But you said it was worth much more." Mr. Kessler's expression hardened. "Oh, it is. Easily worth $12,000 to $15,000 in good condition. But your son was in a hurry, and frankly, he struck me as someone who didn't know what he had. I offered him a fair price for a quick sale, and he took it without question." So Daniel had not only stolen Richard's watch and dismissed my grief, but he'd also lied about how much he'd received for it. The extra money had probably gone toward upgrading their accommodations in Paris. "Keep the watch," Mr. Kessler said gently. "Consider it an investment in justice." That evening, I sat in Richard's study. The room I'd avoided for 3 years because his presence was too strong there. His medical textbooks still lined the shelves, his reading glasses still sat on the desk beside a half-finished crossword puzzle, and his favorite coffee mug still held a collection of pens. I placed the Rolex on his desk and spread out the bank statements under his desk lamp. The transfers had begun 6 months before Richard's death and continued for 2 months after. Daniel had systematically drained our accounts while I'd been focused on hospital visits and treatment schedules. The amounts weren't enormous by themselves, $2,000 here, $3,000 there, but they added up to nearly $40,000. Money that should have gone to Richard's medical care or to securing my future as a widow had instead funded Daniel's lifestyle while his father was dying. I remembered those final months with new clarity now. Daniel's sudden interest in helping with financial matters. His insistence that I didn't need to worry about money during such a stressful time. His offer to handle the bank deposits and bill payments so I could focus on Richard's care. I'd been grateful for his support. I'd actually thanked him for being such a devoted son. The phone rang, interrupting my dark thoughts. Daniel's number appeared on the caller ID. "Mom, I just wanted to check on you. You seemed upset earlier, and I felt bad about hanging up so abruptly." His voice carried that practiced tone of concern he'd perfected over the years, the one that made you forget he'd just hurt you and feel guilty for being upset about it. "I'm fine, Daniel." Good, good. I know the watch thing was hard for you, but honestly, Mom, you'll feel better once you let go of all that old stuff. Vivian's therapist says that clinging to material possessions is just a way of avoiding grief. I wondered if Vivian's therapist also had opinions about sons who stole from their dying fathers, but I kept the thought to myself. "How is Paris?" I asked instead. "Oh, it's incredible. We're staying at this amazing hotel near the Champs-Élysées. The room service alone costs more than most people make in a week, but Vivian deserves the best. She works so hard at the gallery." Vivian worked at her family's art gallery, where her primary duties seemed to involve organizing charity galas and posting Instagram photos of herself with expensive artwork. But I'd learned years ago that pointing out such inconsistencies only led to lectures about my negative attitude. "That sounds lovely," I said. "It really is. And Mom, I want you to know when we get back, Vivian and I want to take you out for a nice dinner. Maybe we can start looking at some senior communities in your area. I know you say you're fine living alone, but at your age, it's really not safe." There it was. The real reason for the call. Daniel wasn't feeling guilty about the watch. He was laying the groundwork for his next move. Get me into a senior community, sell my house, and have even more access to whatever money remained. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said. "Great. I'll make reservations at that place you like downtown. The one with the piano player." After he hung up, I sat in Richard's chair and wondered how I'd raised such a selfish, manipulative man. Had I been too lenient? Too generous? Had I somehow failed as a mother? Then I looked at the bank statements again and felt my guilt transform into something harder and more focused. Daniel wasn't selfish because of poor parenting. He was selfish because he'd learned he could be. Because his charm and my love had always protected him from real consequences. That was about to change. The next morning, Mr. Kessler called with news about the computer chip. "Mrs. Carter, you need to come in as soon as possible. What we found. It's significant." I arrived at the pawn shop to find Mr. Kessler waiting with a younger man who had the intense look of someone who spent most of his time staring at screens. "This is my nephew, David," Mr. Kessler said. "David, tell Mrs. Carter what you found." David pulled out a laptop and opened several files. The chip contained multiple documents, financial records, email correspondences, and what appears to be a detailed investigation your husband was conducting. The screen filled with emails I'd never seen before, messages between Richard and a private investigator named Helen Torres. The subject lines made my heart race. "Daniel Carter Financial Review. Account irregularities confirmed. Evidence package prepared. Your husband hired a private investigator 6 months before he died," David continued. "He suspected your son of embezzling money and wanted proof before confronting him. But Richard never said anything to me about this. According to these emails, he planned to. But his illness progressed faster than expected. The investigator's final report was dated 2 days before your husband's death." David clicked to another file. "There's more. Your husband documented everything: bank statements, forged signatures, even recorded phone conversations where your son discussed hiding assets from you. I stared at the screen, seeing my marriage in an entirely new light. While I'd been focused on Richard's medical care, he'd been fighting a different battle, protecting me from the son who was robbing us both. "There's one more thing," David said quietly. "The final email your husband sent to the investigator. Well, you should read it yourself." The email was brief, but devastating. "Helen, I'm running out of time. If something happens to me before we can expose Daniel's theft, make sure Amelia gets this evidence. My son has stolen over $40,000 while I've been fighting cancer, and I suspect he's planning to take more after I'm gone. Protect my wife. She'll need to know the truth to protect herself. Richard." I realized I was crying only when Mr. Kessler handed me a tissue. Richard had been trying to protect me even while he was dying, and I'd never known. "Mrs. Carter," David said gently, "there's enough evidence here to press criminal charges. Your son forged your husband's signatures, stole from joint accounts, and engaged in systematic fraud over several months." I looked at the Rolex sitting on the desk, no longer just a timepiece, but a message from my husband. A warning and a weapon wrapped in steel and precision. "Can I have copies of everything?" I asked. "Of course. What are you planning to do?" I fastened the Rolex around my wrist for the first time since Richard's death. It was heavier than I remembered, but the weight felt good. Solid. Purposeful. "I'm going to finish what Richard started," I said. "I'm going to protect myself." But as I drove home with copies of all the evidence tucked safely in my purse, I knew I was planning something more than protection. I was planning justice. Daniel had stolen Richard's money, dismissing it as his right. He'd stolen Richard's watch, calling my grief dramatic. He'd stolen my trust and planned to steal my independence. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated his mother. At 60, I might have been old enough to be dismissed and manipulated, but I was also old enough to understand that some betrayals demand consequences. Richard had gathered the evidence, but he hadn't lived long enough to use it. I would us. I spent the next week going through every financial document in the house, cross-referencing Richard's evidence with our bank records and credit card statements. The pattern of Daniel's theft was methodical and calculated. He'd been careful to take amounts that wouldn't immediately trigger alerts, spacing the withdrawals across different accounts, and using forged authorizations that looked legitimate at first glance. But what disturbed me most wasn't the money he'd stolen. It was the timing. According to the private investigator's report, Daniel's theft had accelerated dramatically in the final weeks of Richard's life. While I'd been sleeping in hospital chairs and holding my husband's hand through his final treatments, Daniel had been draining our accounts with increasing desperation. On the day Richard died, Daniel had made 3 separate withdrawals totaling $8,000. The same day. I sat in Richard's study, staring at the bank statements, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Daniel hadn't just stolen from his dying father. He treated Richard's death like a clearance sale, grabbing what he could while I was too grief-stricken to notice. But there was something else troubling me, a memory that had been nagging at the edges of my consciousness since discovering the watch's secrets. Something about Richard's final days that hadn't seemed significant at the time, but now felt ominous. I pulled out Richard's medical files, documents I'd avoided reading since his death because they brought back too much pain. Now I forced myself to go through them systematically, looking for, I wasn't sure what. I found it in the nursing notes from his final week. Multiple entries about Daniel's helpfulness with Richard's medications. How he'd volunteered to manage the complex schedule of pain relievers and anti-nausea drugs. How he'd been so attentive, so concerned about making sure Richard got his medicine exactly on time. One note made me stop breathing. Patient's son very knowledgeable about medications. Suggested adjustment to morphine schedule that seemed to help with comfort levels. Daniel had no medical training. He barely graduated college with a business degree, and most of his working knowledge came from failed entrepreneurial ventures. Why would he be making suggestions about morphine dosages? I found myself dialing the number for Helen Torres, the private investigator Richard had hired. She answered on the third ring with a voice that sounded like she'd spent years hearing other people's worst secrets. Ms. Torres? This is Amelia Carter. My husband Richard hired you before he died. Mrs. Carter. I was wondering if I'd ever hear from you. Your husband spoke about you often. He was very concerned about protecting you. I just discovered the evidence he gathered. About our son. I'm sorry you had to learn about it this way. Richard wanted to handle the situation himself, but his illness progressed so quickly. Ms. Torres, can I ask you something? Did you find anything else suspicious about Daniel's behavior? Beyond the financial theft. There was a long pause. What exactly are you asking, Mrs. Carter? I'm asking if you think my son might have done more than steal money from his dying father. Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Carter, do you have somewhere safe you can talk? Somewhere private. The serious tone in her voice made my hands shake. I'm at home, alone. I'll be there in an hour. Don't discuss this with anyone else until I arrive. Helen Torres turned out to be a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She sat in my living room with a thick file folder and the expression of someone about to deliver very bad news. Your husband hired me because he suspected financial irregularities, she began. But as I investigated Daniel's activities, I found patterns that concerned me beyond simple theft. What kind of patterns? Your son has a history of taking advantage of vulnerable people. His first business failed because he embezzled from elderly clients. His second business was shut down for insurance fraud. He's skilled at identifying people who trust him and exploiting that trust systematically. I thought about all the times over the years when Daniel had asked for loans that were never repaid, for co-signatures on credit applications, for temporary help with rent or car payments. How he'd always had a reasonable explanation and a promise to pay it back soon. But Mrs. Carter, what worried me most was the timing of his thefts from your accounts. The pattern suggested someone who knew exactly when his window of opportunity would close. I don't understand. Helen opened her file and showed me a timeline she'd created. Daniel's theft began 6 months before your husband's death. But the amounts increased dramatically in the final weeks, as if he knew Richard wouldn't be around much longer to catch him. The implications hit me like ice water. You think Daniel knew Richard was going to die sooner than the doctors predicted? I think Daniel may have taken steps to ensure that timeline. The room seemed to tilt around me. You're saying? I'm saying your son had access to your husband's medications, opportunity to alter dosages, and a strong financial motive to accelerate his father's death. The nursing notes show Daniel was unusually involved in medication management, which is uncommon for family members without medical training. I stared at her, my mind refusing to process what she was suggesting. But the doctors said Richard's decline was consistent with his type of cancer. It was. But cancer patients can live months or even years longer than expected with proper pain management and medication compliance. If someone were systematically altering medication dosages, increasing morphine, decreasing anti-nausea drugs, changing the timing of treatments, they could create complications that would appear natural. I thought about Daniel's behavior during those final weeks. His insistence on staying late at the hospital, his volunteering to handle the complex medication schedule, his unusual knowledge about drug interactions and dosages. I'd been touched by his devotion. Now I wondered if I'd been watching my son murder his father. Do you have proof? I whispered. Not the kind that would hold up in court. Richard died 3 years ago, and his body was cremated. But the circumstantial evidence is compelling. The theft pattern, the medication involvement, the suspicious timing of financial transactions. Helen leaned forward, her expression intense. Mrs. Carter, I need you to understand something. If Daniel killed his father for money, you could be in danger too. You're the only thing standing between him and your remaining assets. But I'm his mother. Surely he wouldn't. He stole from his dying father while you were sleeping in hospital chairs. He sold his father's most precious possession and called your grief dramatic. You tell me, what wouldn't he do? I looked down at Richard's Rolex on my wrist, feeling its weight differently now. Not just as a timepiece or a symbol of love, but as evidence of a conspiracy that had been 3 years in the making. What should I do? That depends on what you want to achieve. We could go to the police with what we have, but without Richard's body, proving murder would be nearly impossible. The financial theft is prosecutable, but Daniel would likely get a plea deal and minimal jail time. And then he'd be free to come after me.
Exactly. Or,
Helen paused, studying my face. You could consider other options. Sometimes justice comes in forms the legal system doesn't provide. I thought about Daniel sipping champagne in Paris, funded by his father's stolen money and his mother's broken heart. About his plans to move me into a senior community where he'd have even more control over my finances. About the possibility that he'd murdered Richard to speed up his inheritance timeline. What kind of other options? I asked. Helen smiled, and it wasn't a warm expression. Mrs. Carter, your son thinks he's smarter than everyone around him. That kind of arrogance creates vulnerabilities. Sometimes the best way to stop a predator is to become a better predator. I don't know how to be a predator. No, but I do. And more importantly, you have something Daniel doesn't expect from you. You know the truth about what he's done. That knowledge is power, and power is the foundation of justice. She pulled a business card from her wallet and handed it to me. Think about it, Mrs. Carter. If you decide you want to explore alternatives to the legal system, call me. Richard gathered evidence to protect you, but protection sometimes requires offense. After she left, I sat alone in the gathering darkness, Richard's watch ticking steadily on my wrist like a heartbeat. Somewhere in Europe, Daniel was spending stolen money while planning his next move against his mother. But for the first time since discovering his betrayal, I wasn't feeling like a victim. I was feeling like a woman with nothing left to lose and plenty to avenge. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you think Amelia should do next. Are you Team Justice or Team Forgiveness? Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories of survival and transformation, because sometimes the most shocking revelations come from the people we trust most. And remember, our book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, is filled with wisdom for anyone who's been betrayed by family. The link is in the description below. Now, let's see what Amelia decides to do with the truth. Daniel and Vivian return from Paris on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, Daniel was calling to arrange our promised dinner. His voice bubbled with the satisfaction of someone who'd just had exactly the vacation he'd wanted, funded by exactly the method he'd preferred. Mom, you sound tired. Are you taking care of yourself? The concern in his voice might have fooled me a month ago. Now it sounded like a predator checking on the health of his prey. I'm fine, Daniel. Just the usual aches and pains of getting older. Well, that's exactly what Vivian and I wanted to talk to you about. We found the most amazing senior community while we were in Paris. Well, not in Paris, obviously, but the hotel concierge told us about this place in California that's supposed to be like a resort. All-inclusive, medical care on site, no maintenance worries. I gripped Richard's watch on my wrist, feeling its steady tick like a countdown timer. That sounds expensive. Oh, Mom, you can't put a price on peace of mind. Besides, you'd be surprised how much equity you have in that big house. More than enough to cover a nice place where you'd be safe and cared for. Of course. Sell the house, move me somewhere controlled and monitored, and Daniel would have access to whatever remained of my money. It was a perfect plan for him. Let's discuss it over dinner, I said. When were you thinking? How about Friday? That place downtown with the piano player, just like I promised. Friday would give me 3 days to prepare. 3 days to decide exactly how much justice Richard's death deserved. After Daniel hung up, I called Helen Torres. "I want to explore those alternatives you mentioned," I told her. "I was hoping you'd call. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? I have some ideas about how to approach this." Helen's office was in a nondescript building in downtown Los Angeles, the kind of place where people went when they needed problems solved quietly. Her waiting room could have belonged to any accountant or insurance agent, but the books on her shelves told a different story. Titles about forensic accounting, criminal psychology, and what she called creative problem solving. "Your son has a weakness," Helen said without preamble. "He's arrogant, and he's gotten away with manipulation for so long that he's careless. Those two traits create opportunities." "What kind of opportunities?" "Daniel believes he's smarter than you, which means he won't expect sophisticated retaliation. He also believes you're emotionally dependent on him, which means he'll interpret your compliance as affection rather than strategy." Helen pulled out a thick folder. "I've been investigating Daniel's current financial situation. His business is failing, he's leveraged beyond his means, and Vivian's spending habits are accelerating. They need your money more desperately than you realize." "How desperately?" "Desperately enough that he's already put his condo up for sale. The Paris vacation was funded entirely by what he stole from Richard, and they have less than $5,000 in accessible accounts." This was news to me. Daniel had always presented himself as successful, and his lifestyle certainly suggested prosperity. "It's all leverage and credit," Helen continued. "His business exists primarily on paper, his assets are encumbered, and his cash flow is negative. Without access to your money, he'll be bankrupt within 6 months. So his plan is to move me into senior care and take control of my house and remaining accounts." "Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. I've been tracking his financial patterns, and he's already spent money he doesn't have based on expectations of your future cooperation." Helen showed me printouts of Daniel's recent credit applications and spending patterns. He'd been using my address as collateral for loans, listing my house as an asset he could access, even applying for credit cards using my information. "He's been committing identity theft and fraud on top of everything else," I said, "for at least 6 months. But here's the beautiful part. All of this fraud is based on his assumption that you'll never discover it and never fight back. His entire financial structure depends on your continued cooperation and ignorance." I felt a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. Daniel's arrogance had made him vulnerable in ways he didn't even realize. "What are you suggesting?" Helen smiled that predator's smile again. "I'm suggesting we give Daniel exactly what he's planned for, but with a few modifications he won't see coming." For the next 2 hours, Helen outlined a plan that was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its completeness. We would use Daniel's greed and arrogance against him, letting him believe he was succeeding right up until the moment his entire world collapsed. "The beauty of this approach," Helen said, "is that we're not breaking any laws. We're simply accelerating consequences that Daniel has already set in motion through his own choices." "And do you think this will work?" "I think your son has spent years underestimating women, particularly older women. That blindness is going to cost him everything." As I drove home from Helen's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Richard's death: purpose. For 3 years, I'd been drifting through my days, managing grief and loneliness. Now I had a mission that honored both my husband's memory and my own sense of justice. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Richard died. I cooked his favorite meal: beef bourguignon, the recipe I'd perfected over 30 years of marriage. As the wine and herbs filled the kitchen with rich aromas, I felt Richard's presence more strongly than I had since his funeral. "I know the truth now," I whispered to his photograph on the kitchen counter. "And I'm going to make sure Daniel pays for what he did to you. To us." The Rolex on my wrist seemed to tick a little faster. as if approving of the plan. Friday evening, I dressed carefully for dinner with Daniel and Vivian. I chose a navy blue dress that flattered my figure and made me look prosperous but not ostentatious, paired with my pearls and Richard's watch. I wanted to look like exactly what Daniel expected, a wealthy widow ripe for manipulation. The restaurant Daniel had chosen was expensive but not exclusive, the kind of place designed to impress people who were easily impressed. Daniel and Vivian were already seated when I arrived, both of them practically glowing with post-vacation satisfaction. "Mom, you look wonderful." Daniel stood to kiss my cheek, his cologne expensive and his smile practiced. "Doesn't she look great, Vivian?" Vivian nodded with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been coached on her responses. She was a pretty woman in her early 30s, all blonde highlights and designer accessories, but there was a calculating sharpness in her eyes that reminded me of a cat watching a canary. "Amelia, I love that watch," she said, gesturing to Richard's Rolex. "Very classic." "Thank you, dear. It was my husband's." "Oh, right. Daniel told me about that whole drama with the pawn shop." "I'm so glad you were able to work that out." The casual way she dismissed my drama told me everything I needed to know about how Daniel had presented the situation to his wife. I smiled serenely and took my seat. Dinner conversation was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as concern. Daniel and Vivian tag-teamed me with stories about elderly people they knew who'd been victimized by scammers, who'd fallen in their homes, who'd struggled with maintaining large properties. The subtext was clear. You're vulnerable, you need protection, and we're the ones to provide it. "The thing is, Mom," Daniel said as we shared dessert, "Vivian and I worry about you rattling around in that big house all alone. Anything could happen." "I have good neighbors," I replied. "And an excellent security system." "But what if you fell in the shower? What if someone tried to break in? At your age, you just can't respond to emergencies the way you used to." Vivian leaned forward conspiratorially. "We looked at some places online while we were in Paris. There are some absolutely gorgeous senior communities in California, like luxury resorts, but with medical care included." "They sound expensive," I said, playing my part perfectly. "Well, that's the amazing thing," Daniel said, his eyes lighting up with the fervor of a practiced salesman. "The equity in your house would more than cover the entrance fee, and the monthly costs are actually less than what you're spending on maintenance and utilities now. Plus," Vivian added, "you'd have built-in social opportunities. No more lonely evenings." I let them talk, nodding occasionally and asking the kinds of questions a confused elderly woman might ask. They had brochures ready, financial projections prepared, and answers to every objection. It was a polished presentation that had clearly been rehearsed during their romantic Parisian getaway. "I suppose it might be worth looking into," I said finally, watching Daniel's face light up with triumph. "Really? That's wonderful, Mom. I'll call some places tomorrow and set up tours." "Not too fast," I said, just enough hesitation to make it believable. "This is a big decision. I'd want to think about it carefully." Of course, Daniel said quickly. "Take all the time you need. But Mom, just promise me you'll keep an open mind. This could be the best thing that ever happened to you." As they drove me home, Daniel insisting it wasn't safe for me to drive at night, I listened to them plan my future with the casual confidence of people dividing up an inheritance before the funeral. "The house should sell quickly in this market," Vivian was saying, "especially with all the work Amelia's put into it over the years. And Mom's got that life insurance policy from Dad's work," Daniel added, "plus whatever's left in the retirement accounts." They were discussing my assets like I wasn't sitting in the back seat, like I was already dead or incompetent. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. "Just remember," Daniel continued, "we need to be patient. Mom has to think this is her idea, or she'll get stubborn about it." "Don't worry," Vivian replied. "She's lonely and scared. She'll come around once she realizes how much easier life could be." As Daniel walked me to my door, he was all concerned son again. Mom, I'm so proud of you for being open to new possibilities. Dad would have wanted you to be safe and happy. The mention of Richard, the man Daniel had likely murdered, sent a flash of rage through me so intense I had to grip the doorframe to keep from showing it. Thank you for dinner, dear, I said instead. It was lovely. Inside my house, I poured myself a glass of Richard's best wine and called Helen Torres. Phase 1 is complete, I told her. They think they have me convinced. Perfect. Are you ready for Phase 2? I looked at Richard's photograph on the mantelpiece, then down at his watch on my wrist. Somewhere in the city, Daniel and Vivian were celebrating what they thought was their victory, counting money they thought they were about to steal. Oh yes, I said. I'm more than ready. The next morning, Helen set the second phase in motion with a series of phone calls that would begin Daniel's downfall. The plan was sophisticated but appeared coincidental, a confluence of bad luck that would slowly strangle Daniel's financial life while I maintained the appearance of a confused elderly woman simply trying to make good decisions. The first call went to the credit agencies, reporting identity theft on my accounts. The second went to the banks, where Daniel had used my information as collateral, questioning the validity of loan applications I'd never signed. The third went to several of Daniel's business creditors, providing anonymous tips about irregularities in his financial statements. Within hours, Daniel's carefully constructed house of cards began to tremble. Credit lines were frozen, loan applications were flagged for investigation, and business relationships that depended on his reputation for financial stability started to deteriorate. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. Helen had discovered that Daniel's business partner, a man named Trevor who handled the company's day-to-day operations, had been growing suspicious of Daniel's financial practices. Trevor had noticed irregularities in their accounts, unexplained expenses, and Daniel's increasing desperation for cash flow. All it took was one anonymous phone call suggesting Trevor look more closely at Daniel's recent activities, particularly his access to elderly clients' accounts. Trevor's investigation took less than a week to uncover what Daniel thought he'd hidden carefully. The embezzlement, the forged documents, the systematic theft from clients who'd trusted Daniel with their financial planning. On Thursday morning, exactly 6 days after our dinner, Daniel called me in a panic. Mom, something terrible has happened. There's been some kind of misunderstanding with my business accounts, and Trevor is making these crazy accusations. What kind of accusations? I asked, my voice filled with motherly concern. He says I've been stealing from clients, which is insane. He's threatening to go to the police and file charges. Mom, I don't know what to do. I let him talk, listening to him spin an elaborate story about being framed by his jealous partner, about being the victim of a conspiracy designed to destroy his reputation. He was convincing in the way that practiced liars often are, and I found myself almost admiring his skill. Almost. Daniel, surely there's been some mistake, I said. That's exactly what I keep telling everyone. But Mom, Trevor's frozen all our business accounts. I can't access any of our money, and we have bills due and the mortgage payment. His voice broke convincingly. I don't know how I'm going to fix this. What can I do to help, sweetheart? The relief in his voice was audible. Actually, Mom, there is something. I need to hire a lawyer to fight these false accusations, but all my money is tied up in the frozen accounts. Could you possibly, just as a loan, just until this gets sorted out, could you help me with the legal fees? How much do you need? 20,000 would cover a really good attorney. I know it's a lot, but Mom, my entire future is at stake here.
$22,000.
The same amount he'd stolen from Richard while his father was dying. Of course, Daniel. I'll call the bank this afternoon. Really? Oh, Mom, thank you. You're saving my life here. After he hung up, I sat in Richard's study, staring at the evidence of Daniel's crimes spread across the desk. Helen's plan was working perfectly. Daniel's desperation was making him careless, and his trust in my continued gullibility was leading him deeper into the trap we'd set. But I wasn't going to give him $20,000 to fight charges of embezzling from elderly clients. I was going to give him exactly what he'd given his father, a slow, methodical destruction that he wouldn't see coming until it was far too late to stop. I called Daniel back that evening with news that made his voice shake with relief. I spoke to my financial advisor today, I told him. He suggested that instead of a simple loan, we structure this as an investment in your business. That way, when you clear up these accusations, I'll be positioned to benefit from your success. An investment? Mom, that's brilliant. You're so much smarter about these things than I give you credit for. The irony was lost on him completely. My advisor wants to meet with you tomorrow to discuss the details. He has some paperwork that will protect both of us legally. Of course. Whatever he needs. The financial advisor was actually Helen Torres, using credentials from her previous career in forensic accounting. She met Daniel at a downtown office that she'd rented for exactly this purpose. Professional, expensive-looking, and completely legitimate. Daniel arrived wearing his best suit and his most charming smile, ready to manipulate what he thought was another elderly person's financial representative. Helen greeted him with a perfect blend of professional courtesy and subtle condescension that men like Daniel expected from service providers. "Mr. Carter, your mother speaks very highly of you," Helen said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "She's quite concerned about these legal troubles you're facing." "It's all a misunderstanding," Daniel said smoothly. "My business partner has made some serious accusations that I'm confident will be cleared up once the authorities review the actual evidence." "Of course. Now, your mother mentioned you need $20,000 for legal fees." "That's correct. Just as a temporary measure until my business accounts are unfrozen." Helen nodded and pulled out a thick contract. "I've prepared investment documentation that will protect your mother's interests while providing you with the funds you need. However, I should mention that my investigation into your business has raised some concerns." Daniel's confidence flickered slightly. "What kind of concerns?" "Well, your company's financial statements show some irregularities. Unexplained transfers, documentation inconsistencies. I'm sure there are reasonable explanations, but as your mother's advisor, I need to understand the full scope of her risk exposure." Helen opened a file and began reading from Daniel's own business records that showed his systematic theft from elderly clients, his falsified financial statements, and his use of company funds for personal expenses. With each revelation, Daniel's charm cracked a little more. The smooth-talking manipulator was being confronted with evidence of his crimes by someone who understood financial fraud better than he did. "I can explain all of this," Daniel said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "I'm sure you can. But, Mr. Carter, I need you to understand. If I'm going to recommend that your mother invest in your business, I need absolute transparency about your financial practices." Helen leaned forward, and her expression shifted from professional courtesy to something much harder. "For instance, I need you to explain these transfers from joint accounts belonging to Richard and Amelia Carter during the months before your father's death." Daniel went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Really? Because I have bank statements showing systematic withdrawals from accounts where you weren't an authorized user. Withdrawals that required forged signatures." The silence stretched between them while Daniel processed what was happening. This wasn't a simple loan meeting anymore. This was an interrogation. "Who are you?" he whispered. Helen smiled that predator's smile. "I'm someone who investigates financial crimes for a living. And I'm someone your father hired before he died to protect your mother from exactly this kind of theft." Daniel bolted from the chair and headed for the door, but Helen's voice stopped him. "Mr. Carter, you can leave if you want to. But the evidence I have doesn't disappear just because you run away from it. Your business partner has already filed criminal charges." The IRS has been notified about your tax irregularities. And your mother now knows exactly what kind of man you really are. My mother doesn't know anything about this, Daniel said, but there was desperation in his voice now. Doesn't she? Who do you think hired me to investigate you? Who do you think provided me with access to your father's evidence? Your mother may be 60 years old, but she's not the confused, elderly woman you think she is. Daniel sank back into the chair, his face gray with shock. She knows. She knows everything. The theft, the fraud, the way you manipulated her grief to steal her husband's watch. She knows about the forged signatures and the fake business statements. She even knows about your plans to move her into senior care so you could access her house and remaining assets. Helen stood and walked around the desk, looming over Daniel like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. But most importantly, Mr. Carter, she knows how your thefts accelerated in the weeks before your father's death. She knows about your unusual involvement in his medication schedule. And she has questions about whether your crime family includes murder as well as embezzlement. That's insane, Daniel stammered. I would never hurt my father. Wouldn't you? You stole from him while he was dying. You sold his most precious possession and called your mother's grief dramatic. You've spent 3 years planning to defraud her out of everything she has left. Tell me, Mr. Carter, what wouldn't you do for money? Daniel sat in stunned silence, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The charming, successful businessman facade had disappeared completely, revealing the desperate, amoral criminal underneath. What do you want? He finally whispered. Justice, Helen replied simply. Your father gathered evidence to protect your mother, but he died before he could use it. We're going to use it for him. She handed Daniel a new document, not an investment contract, but a comprehensive confession detailing his crimes against both his parents. You're going to sign this confession. You're going to liquidate whatever assets you have left to begin making restitution. And you're going to disappear from your mother's life permanently. And if I don't, Helen's smile was razor sharp. Then I take everything I have to the police, the IRS, and every news outlet in the city. Your business partner's criminal charges will look like a minor inconvenience compared to what I can do to you. Daniel stared at the confession with the trapped expression of an animal that had finally been cornered. You have 24 hours to decide, Helen continued. Sign the confession and disappear quietly, or face the full consequences of everything you've done. But understand this, your mother is done being your victim. One way or another, this ends now. As Daniel stumbled out of the office, Helen called me with an update. Phase 2 is complete, she said. He knows we have him, and he knows there's no way out. Now we see what kind of man he really is when his back is against the wall. I sat in Richard's study, his watch ticking steadily on my wrist, and wondered what my son would choose. Would he have enough decency left to accept responsibility for his crimes? Or would his arrogance and desperation drive him to even more destructive choices? Either way, the trap was set. All that remained was to see whether Daniel would sign his confession or force us to destroy him completely. Richard's justice was finally at hand. 23 hours after Helen's ultimatum, Daniel was pounding on my front door at 11 o'clock at night. I'd been expecting this visit, had been preparing for it since Helen called to tell me he'd left the office, without signing the confession. Through the peephole, I could see he looked haggard and desperate, his expensive clothes wrinkled, and his usual polish completely gone. This was Daniel stripped of his charm and manipulation, reduced to what he'd always been underneath, a scared child looking for someone else to solve his problems. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. Mom, we need to talk. It's rather late, Daniel.
Please.
This is important. I stepped aside and let him enter, noting how his hands shook and how his eyes darted around the room like he was looking for escape routes. He'd aged years in a single day. Mom, someone is trying to destroy me. They've hired investigators. They're spreading lies about my business. They're trying to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. I settled into my favorite chair and folded my hands calmly in my lap. What kind of crimes? Theft, fraud, embezzlement. It's all lies designed to ruin my reputation. Someone has it out for me, and they're using you to get to me. Using me how? Daniel began pacing, his agitation growing with each step. They're telling you things about me, making you suspicious, turning you against your own son. Mom, you have to listen to me. I would never steal from you or Dad. I love you. I know you love me, Daniel, I said gently. Just like I know you sold your father's watch to pay for your vacation. He stopped pacing and stared at me. That's different. That was just what? Just theft from your grieving mother? It was practical. You were being sentimental about a piece of metal, and Vivian and I needed the money for your vacation to Paris. Yes, I know. Something in my tone made him look at me more carefully. The maternal warmth he'd always counted on was missing, replaced by something cooler and more dangerous. Mom, you're scaring me. You don't sound like yourself. Don't I? Maybe this is who I've always been, and you just never bothered to notice. Daniel sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. They showed me documents, bank statements, things that made it look like I was stealing from you and Dad. But I can explain all of that. Can you? Can you explain the $40,000 you transferred from our accounts while your father was dying? Can you explain the forged signatures, the fake authorizations, the way you accelerated your theft when you knew Richard was too weak to stop you? Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. How do you know about the money you stole? About the systematic way you robbed your dying father while I was sleeping in hospital chairs? About the way you treated Richard's death like a clearance sale? I stood and walked to Richard's photograph on the mantelpiece, feeling the weight of his watch on my wrist like a reminder of everything we'd lost. I know because your father knew, Daniel. He hired a private investigator to document your crimes before he died. He left me evidence, hidden in the very watch you were so eager to sell. The blood drained from Daniel's face. That's impossible. Is it? Richard was a smart man who married a smart woman. Did you really think we'd never figure out what you were doing? I turned to face him, and he flinched at whatever he saw in my expression. But the worst part, Daniel, isn't the money you stole. It's the way you used your father's illness as an opportunity. The way you manipulated his medications, involved yourself in his care schedule, made suggestions about drug dosages you had no business making. I was trying to help him, Daniel whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. Were you? Or were you trying to make sure he died before he could expose your theft? The accusation hung in the air between us like poison gas. Daniel stared at me with the trapped expression of an animal that had run out of places to hide. You think I killed Dad? I think you stole from him while he was dying, and I think you were prepared to do whatever it took to protect yourself from consequences. What I don't know is whether you actively hastened his death or simply didn't care if your actions made him worse. Daniel stood up abruptly, his desperation transforming into anger. This is insane. You're my mother. How can you believe these lies about me? Because they're not lies, Daniel. They're facts, documented by your father and confirmed by investigators. You are a thief, a fraud, and quite possibly a murderer. I'm your son. No, I said quietly. My son died the day he decided to steal from his dying father. What you are is a criminal who happens to share my DNA. The words hit him like physical blows. He stumbled backward, his face crumbling with the realization that his mother, the woman who'd always forgiven him, always made excuses for him, always been there to solve his problems, was finally done. Mom, please. I can fix this. I can make it right. Just tell me what you want me to do. I walked to Richard's desk and picked up a copy of the confession Helen had prepared. I want you to sign this. Daniel took the document with shaking hands and read the first few paragraphs. His face went white as he processed the comprehensive nature of his admissions. "If I sign this, I'll go to prison. If you don't sign it, you'll go to prison anyway. The only difference is whether you face your crimes with whatever dignity you have left, or whether I destroy you so completely that your name becomes synonymous with elder abuse and patricide." Daniel looked up at me with the desperate eyes of someone who'd finally realized the game was over. "What happens if I sign it?" "You liquidate your remaining assets to begin making restitution. You dissolve your business and cooperate fully with the investigation of your crimes. You divorce Vivian and disappear from my life permanently. And you pray that the evidence against you for Richard's death isn't strong enough to support murder charges." "And if I don't?" I smiled, and it was Helen's predator smile reflected in my features. "Then I release everything to the police, the media, and anyone else who might be interested in the story of a son who stole from his dying father and may have murdered him for an inheritance. I'll make sure your face is on every news broadcast in the city, your name in every newspaper article about financial elder abuse. You'll become famous as the most despicable kind of criminal, the one who preys on his own family." Daniel stared at the confession, then at me, then back at the document that would end his life as he'd known it. "This isn't justice," he whispered. "This is revenge." "Sometimes," I replied calmly, "they're the same thing." He sat at Richard's desk with a pen in his trembling hand, and I watched my son face the first real consequences of his adult life. For 60 years, I'd protected him from the full weight of his choices. For 3 years, he'd counted on my grief and loneliness to keep me manageable. But the woman standing in that room wasn't the grieving widow who'd been easy to manipulate. She was someone harder, someone who'd learned that love without boundaries was just another form of abuse. Daniel signed his name at the bottom of the confession, and with that signature, he signed away any claim to my forgiveness or my future. Justice for Richard was finally at hand. Are you feeling the intensity of this moment? If Amelia's transformation is inspiring you, hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own self-respect? This community supports each other through the hardest decisions. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories, and remember, our book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, offers guidance for anyone rebuilding their life after betrayal. The link is in the description. Now let's see how Daniel's story ends. The aftermath of Daniel's confession unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of consequences. Within a week, his business was officially dissolved, his assets were seized for restitution, and criminal charges were filed in 3 different jurisdictions. Trevor, his former business partner, cooperated fully with authorities in exchange for immunity, providing detailed evidence of Daniel's systematic theft from elderly clients. Vivian filed for divorce the moment she realized Daniel's financial situation was hopeless. She moved out of their condo and back in with her parents, taking everything of value she could carry and leaving Daniel with nothing but legal bills and criminal liability. I watched it all unfold from the safety of my home, feeling something I hadn't experienced since Richard's death. Peace. But there was one more conversation I needed to have with my son before his story reached its final chapter. Daniel called me on a Thursday morning, his voice hollow with defeat. "Mom, they're going to arrest me tomorrow. The district attorney is filing formal charges for elder abuse, fraud, and embezzlement. I know. I need you to understand, I never meant for things to go this far. It started small, just borrowing money I intended to pay back, and then it snowballed." I listened to him try to minimize and rationalize his crimes, the same patterns of behavior that had enabled his escalation from petty theft to patricide. "Daniel, do you know what your father said to me the night before he died?" The question stopped his self-justification mid-sentence. He said, "Amelia, I'm worried about you being alone. Not because you can't take care of yourself, but because there are people who will try to take advantage of your kindness." Promise me you'll be strong enough to protect yourself, even from people you love." My voice broke slightly on those last words, remembering Richard's weak grip on my hand as he'd made me promise something I hadn't understood at the time. I promised him I would be strong. But for 3 years after his death, I forgot that promise. I let loneliness and grief make me vulnerable to exactly the kind of person he'd warned me about. "Mom. You, Daniel. He was warning me about you." The silence stretched between us, filled with 32 years of misplaced maternal love and wasted second chances. "Did you kill him?" I asked finally, the question I'd been avoiding for months. Another long silence. "I don't know," Daniel whispered, and the honesty of that admission hit me harder than any denial would have. "What do you mean you don't know?" "I mean, I was so focused on getting the money before he could stop me that I might have made choices that weren't in his best interest. I might have been more worried about my own problems than his health." It wasn't a confession of murder, but it was an acknowledgement of something almost worse. Such complete selfishness that he'd been willing to risk his father's life for financial gain, even if he hadn't consciously intended to cause Richard's death. "Do you understand what you've lost?" I asked. "My freedom, my marriage, my business, my future." "No, Daniel. You've lost your family. You've lost the unconditional love of the woman who gave birth to you, raised you, and would have done anything to protect you. You've lost the memory of a father who worked his entire life to provide for you. You've lost the right to call yourself someone's son." I could hear him crying on the other end of the line, but I felt no impulse to comfort him. The maternal instinct that had driven me for 60 years had been surgically removed by his betrayal. "Is there any way back from this?" he asked. I thought about Richard's watch on my wrist, about the evidence hidden in its mechanism, about the systematic way Daniel had stolen from his dying father and dismissed his mother's grief. "Ask me again in 20 years, I said finally, "after you've served your time and proven you can be a decent human being without someone else's money making it easy." 20 years. 20 years minimum. If you're very lucky and work very hard to become someone worth forgiving. I hung up on my son for the last time. Daniel was arrested the next morning at the cheap motel where he'd been staying since Vivian kicked him out. The local news covered his perp walk with the breathless excitement that always accompanies stories about trusted family members who prey on the elderly. The headlines were everything I could have hoped for. Son accused of stealing from dying father. Family financial advisor charged with elder abuse. Local man faces murder investigation in father's death. Helen called me that evening with updates on the legal proceedings. "The prosecution is confident they can get convictions on the financial crimes," she reported. "The evidence is overwhelming, and Daniel's confession makes it impossible for him to claim innocence." "What about the murder charges?" "That's more complicated. The investigators are exhuming your husband's body for additional toxicology tests, but after 3 years, physical evidence will be limited. However, the pattern of behavior, the timing of the thefts, and Daniel's admission that he might have made choices that weren't in Richard's best interest could be enough to support manslaughter charges." I thought about Richard's body being disturbed after 3 years of peaceful rest, and I felt a flash of anger at Daniel for making even this violation necessary. How long will he likely serve? For the financial crimes alone, probably 8 to 12 years. If they can prove he hastened your husband's death, we're looking at 25 to life. 25 to life. The same amount of time Daniel had stolen from Richard, assuming the cancer would have allowed my husband several more years of life with proper care. There was a poetic justice to it that Richard would have appreciated. That night, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint my roses in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt truly alone, but it was a chosen solitude rather than an imposed one. I was no longer the grieving widow who'd been easy to manipulate and exploit. I was a woman who discovered her own strength, who'd learned that love without boundaries enabled the very behavior it claimed to forgive. At 60, I'd finally learned what Richard had tried to teach me in his final warning, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be destroyed by the people you care about most. Richard's watch ticked steadily on my wrist, no longer keeping time but keeping faith, faith that justice, however delayed, would eventually find its mark. 6 months after Daniel's arrest, I sat in a courtroom watching my son accept a plea bargain that would send him to prison for 15 years. The prosecution had agreed to drop the murder charges in exchange for guilty pleas to elder abuse, fraud, and embezzlement, a compromise that satisfied everyone except the part of me that wanted him to face full accountability for Richard's death. But 15 years was a long time. Long enough for Daniel to understand the weight of what he'd lost, perhaps long enough for him to become someone worth forgiving. Daniel wore an orange jumpsuit and shackles, his once perfect appearance reduced to institutional anonymity. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood and looked directly at me for the first time since his arrest. "Your Honor, I want to apologize to my mother, Amelia Carter, for the pain I've caused her. I betrayed her trust, stole her money, and dishonored my father's memory. I have no excuse for my actions, and I accept full responsibility for the consequences." It was the first completely honest thing he'd said to me in years, and I felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in state prison, with possibility of parole in 10 years if he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. As the bailiff led him away, Daniel turned one last time to look at me. I didn't wave or smile or offer any maternal comfort, but I didn't look away either. After the hearing, Helen and I went for coffee to discuss the final phase of settling Richard's affairs and ensuring that nothing like this could happen again. "The restitution payments will continue for the full term of Daniel's sentence," Helen explained. "His remaining assets have been liquidated, and he'll be required to turn over any income he earns in prison." "How much did we recover?" "About 60% of what he stole from you and your husband. The rest was spent on his lifestyle, Vivian's shopping habits, and that European vacation." I thought about Daniel and Vivian laughing in Parisian cafes, funded by money stolen from Richard's deathbed, and felt the familiar flash of cold anger. What about the other victims? His business clients. They'll receive restitution payments as well, though it will take years to fully compensate everyone he defrauded. The good news is that his conviction has made it easier for other victims to come forward and file civil suits. Over the following months, I watched Daniel's criminal network unravel completely. Trevor faced his own criminal charges for failing to report Daniel's thefts. 3 other elderly clients came forward with stories of being defrauded by Daniel's company. Even Vivian faced legal consequences for spending money she'd known was stolen. The local media had turned Daniel into a cautionary tale about elder abuse, and several advocacy groups had used his case to push for stronger legal protections for elderly victims of financial crime. Richard's death had become part of a larger conversation about the vulnerability of sick and aging people to exploitation by their own families. In a strange way, Daniel's crimes had ended up serving a purpose beyond our personal drama. They'd helped other families protect themselves from similar betrayals. But for me, the most satisfying aspect of Daniel's downfall wasn't the justice or the recovered money or even the public vindication. It was the discovery of who I could be when I stopped making excuses for other people's behavior. At 61, I'd found a strength I'd never known I possessed. I'd learned that maternal love didn't have to mean maternal martyrdom, that protecting yourself from harmful people wasn't selfish even when those people were your own children. I'd also discovered that I enjoyed being formidable. Helen had offered me a job working with her investigations firm, helping other elderly victims of financial fraud navigate the legal system. The work was challenging and emotionally difficult, but it felt like the most meaningful thing I'd ever done. "You have a gift for understanding how these criminals think," Helen told me during one of our case reviews. And more importantly, you have the credibility that comes from having survived it yourself. I'd started speaking to community groups about financial safety for seniors, sharing Richard's story and my own experience as cautionary tales. The presentations were always emotional, both for me and for my audiences, but they served a purpose that felt like honoring Richard's memory in a way that transcended personal revenge. Most surprisingly, I discovered that I was good at being alone. The loneliness that had made me vulnerable to Daniel's manipulation had been replaced by solitude that felt chosen and empowering. I had friends, meaningful work, and interests that had nothing to do with managing other people's needs or emotions. Richard's watch had become my daily reminder of the strength I'd found in his final gift to me, not just the evidence that had brought Daniel to justice, but the knowledge that love could be fierce and protective without being enabling or destructive. The transformation hadn't been easy. There were nights when I questioned whether I'd been too harsh, moments when maternal instinct warred with hard-won wisdom. But each time doubt crept in, I remembered Richard's warning about protecting myself from people who would exploit my kindness. I'd learned that setting boundaries wasn't cruel, it was necessary. That some people would only respect limits that were enforced with consequences. That love without accountability enabled the very behavior it claimed to forgive. 2 years after Daniel's sentencing, I received an unexpected letter from him in prison. The envelope was hand-addressed in careful script that looked nothing like the hurried scrawl I remembered from his youth. Prison, apparently, had taught him patience along with penmanship. I almost threw the letter away without reading it, but curiosity won out over caution. Dear Mom, I know I have no right to contact you, and I'll understand if you don't read this, or if you never respond. But my therapist here says that making amends requires taking responsibility without expecting forgiveness, so that's what I'm trying to do. I've had 2 years to think about what I did to you and Dad, and I finally understand that it wasn't just theft or fraud. It was betrayal of the deepest kind, the destruction of trust between people who are supposed to love and protect each other. I stole more than money from Dad while he was dying. I stole his peace of mind, his ability to trust his own son during his final months. I made his death harder than it needed to be, and I robbed you of the chance to focus entirely on caring for him without worrying about financial security. I also understand now that my involvement in Dad's medical care wasn't helpful. It was dangerous. I was so focused on my own problems, so desperate to keep him from discovering my theft, that I may have made choices that shortened his life. I may not have intended to kill him, but my selfishness and desperation created risks to his health that I had no right to create. I can't undo what I did, and I can't give you back the husband and father I took from our family. But I want you to know that I understand the magnitude of my crimes now, not just legally but morally. I'm not asking for forgiveness, because I know that's not something I can earn back, especially not from prison. I'm not asking you to visit or write back or have any relationship with me at all. I'm just asking you to know that the son you raised, the one who cared about right and wrong, who understood the value of family love, that person still exists somewhere inside the criminal who hurt you so badly. I hope you're happy, Mom. I hope you've found peace and purpose in your life without me in it. You deserve all the joy and love and security that I tried to steal from you. Love always, even though I have no right to it. Daniel. I read the letter 3 times, looking for signs of manipulation or self-pity, but found instead something I'd never seen in any of Daniel's previous communications: genuine accountability, without expectation of reward. It was, I realized, the first truly mature thing my son had ever said to me. I didn't respond to the letter, but I kept it. Not as a sign that I was ready for reconciliation, but as evidence that people could change, even people who'd done terrible things. It gave me hope that the 15 years Daniel would spend in prison might actually transform him into someone worthy of the love I'd once given him unconditionally. That evening, I sat in Richard's study, now my study, writing in the journal I'd started keeping since Daniel's arrest. The room had evolved from a shrine to Richard's memory into a workspace where I planned my advocacy efforts and processed my own healing. Richard's photograph still sat on the desk, but it was surrounded now by pictures from my new life. Helen and me at a conference on elder abuse prevention, a group photo from one of my speaking engagements, shots from my recent trip to Scotland where I'd finally taken the vacation Richard and I had always planned, but never managed. I'd learned to travel alone, to make decisions based on my own preferences rather than other people's needs, to build relationships with people who valued my strength rather than exploiting my kindness. At 63, I was happier than I'd been since the early years of my marriage to Richard. Not because I'd gotten revenge on Daniel, though his conviction had certainly provided closure, but because I discovered who I could be when I stopped defining myself through other people's problems. The Rolex on my wrist had become less about Richard's memory and more about my own transformation. It marked time differently now, not the hours I'd lost to grief and manipulation, but the moments I'd gained through self-respect and purposeful living. I'd established a foundation in Richard's name that provided legal assistance to elderly victims of financial fraud. Helen served as its director, and I used my speaking fees to fund cases for people who couldn't afford private investigators or specialized attorneys. The foundation had helped dozens of families recover stolen assets and bring criminal charges against adult children, caregivers, and financial advisors who'd exploited vulnerable seniors. Each case felt like another small victory in Richard's honor, another way of using our painful experience to prevent similar tragedies. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my new life was the knowledge that I'd finally learned the lesson Richard had tried to teach me in his final warning, that love without boundaries enables the very destruction it claims to prevent. I no longer made excuses for people who hurt me, no longer prioritized other people's comfort over my own safety, no longer confused enabling with kindness or boundaries with selfishness. Daniel would serve his 15-year sentence and perhaps emerge as someone capable of earning forgiveness. Or perhaps he would remain the manipulative narcissist who'd stolen from his dying father and dismissed his mother's grief as drama. Either way, it was no longer my responsibility to manage his consequences or provide him with unconditional love regardless of his behavior. That night, I wound Richard's watch carefully and placed it in its velvet box, no longer empty, but full of the justice we'd finally achieved together. Tomorrow I would wear it again, not as a memorial to loss, but as a celebration of the strength that loss had taught me. At 63, I'd learned that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Richard's death had seemed like the end of everything meaningful in my life. Daniel's betrayal had felt like the final blow to a family already broken by grief. Instead, both losses had become the foundation for a life more authentic and purposeful than anything I'd ever imagined possible. The woman who'd been easy to manipulate and exploit was gone. In her place was someone harder but not bitter, someone strong enough to protect herself without becoming cruel, someone who understood that the highest form of love sometimes requires saying no to the people you care about most. Richard's watch had stopped keeping time for him years ago, but it was keeping perfect time for the woman I'd become. And there you have it, Amelia's incredible transformation from victim to victor. If this story moved you, if it made you realize that you have more strength than you ever imagined, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was betraying you? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting yourself? Your story matters, and this community is here to support you through the difficult decisions. And if you're currently dealing with family members who are manipulating your love, who are treating you as if your feelings don't matter, who are exploiting your kindness, I need you to hear this. You are not powerless. You are not too old to stand up for yourself. Amelia was 60 when her world fell apart, and look at the incredible life she built from the ashes. This is exactly why we wrote our book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain. It's filled with practical, proven strategies for recognizing manipulation, setting healthy boundaries, and rebuilding your life on your own terms. Whether you're dealing with toxic family members, recovering from betrayal, or simply ready to stop putting everyone else's needs before your own, this book will guide you step by step toward the strength and peace you deserve. Don't wait for someone else's permission to put yourself first. Don't wait for toxic people to change. Don't wait until you've lost everything like Amelia did. Click the link in the description box and get your copy of Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain today, because your healing journey starts with one decision to value yourself enough to protect yourself. If this story inspired you, subscribe to Her True Stories and hit that notification bell. We share powerful tales of survival, justice, and transformation every week because the world needs to hear these stories of strength and resilience. Remember, you are stronger than you know, wiser than you believe, and more valuable than anyone who doesn't treat you with respect. Your best chapters are still waiting to be written, just like Amelia's were. Until next time, keep fighting for yourself, because you are absolutely worth fighting for.